Browne, and welcome back to Philosophy at UQ. Laurence is talking today on coincidence in fiction and literature. Laurence did his PhD. I first met him when he was doing his PhD here in UQ some time ago now, and he was working with Phil Dow, and I was running the milestones, the PhD milestones at that stage. So at three points throughout Lawrence's PhD, I got to read his work. And then I got to read the whole thing before he submitted, and it was brilliant. It was really brilliant. And it ended up being
$20.
Yes.
3 copies.
Really fabulous. Anyway, he's just doing the most interesting work. And since he's finished and since he published his book on coincidence, he's branched out into some fabulous work on coincidence in literature. So I'll just read out some of the things. He's got a piece that's about to come out in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology, Coincidence in Chinese Fiction and Chinese Influence Fiction. There are other pieces, Meaningful Coincidence in Fiction and Anecdote, Coincidence in Fiction and Literature, some difficulties in coincidence analysis. And then forthcoming, Flammarion engraving and its symbolic potential, Significance of the Tao for Jung and Heidegger, and then a forthcoming book, chapter Synchronicity in the Tao, which will be included in Nature and Wisdom of the Tao Te Ching. So you can see the kind of work that he's doing at the moment, and I will pass him over to you directly. Thanks. Thank you and welcome.
Right, I'm just setting. Okay, well, it's very lovely to be here because we've actually, Michelle, you might not see me, if you could move a bit, yeah, because I have to stand with a camera.
So you want me
to go
so you can see.
So I can see you.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah. This has been on the books for at least more than a year and has 2 cancellations, or maybe 3. So we're finally getting it done. So I'm very pleased about that. And in these days of COVID, I'm very happy that there are 6 people in the room. So it doesn't worry me at all. Okay. Now I'm going to read because otherwise I won't get it done. I'm going to get through it. All right. Coincidences are fairly common in everyday life, though interpretations as to why they occur or what they mean most certainly differ. There are lots of books and theories on what coincidences represent, from mathematical probability to Jung's theory of synchronicity. However, relatively little has been written about coincidences in fiction and literature. And literature here refers to literary fiction, to be distinguished by its reputedly highbrow status from popular fiction, though the two may overlap. But before getting into the main part of the presentation, I'd like to recount a coincidence of my own, one which prompted me to have a good look at coincidences in fiction. It was around the year 2000, and I was staying with my parents in Guildford, in the UK. And I decided I would make a real effort to read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. According to my mother, this had been my grandfather's favorite book. He had traveled on the Trans-Siberian Railway some 30 times to get to and from his tea business in Shanghai, and he spoke some Russian. So I thought I ought to give it a go. So one morning, I went into one of the better bookshops in Guildford, headed for the classical book section, and began leafing through some of the translations of the Brothers Karamazov, trying to decide which one to select. Then, quite unexpectedly, a tall, fair-haired man addressed me from a few feet away, pointing to a particular volume, and he said, "Why don't you try that one?" So I picked it out, had a look at the front and back covers, and then on impulse found myself asking him if he was the translator. Perhaps it was his proprietorial manner that made me think that. Anyway, he looked shocked, as if caught out, and immediately turned on his heel and walked out of the bookshop. I was rather startled at this, but later my suspicions seemed to be confirmed when I saw a leaflet for a Slavonic conference taking place at the local university. I was sorry he had left so abruptly, but was sufficiently intrigued to have a good look at the version he had recommended. One thing I noticed is the title was The Karamazov Brothers, not the usual Brothers Karamazov. I bought it and thoroughly enjoyed the lively and lucid rendering of this extraordinary work, Dostoevsky's last and arguably his greatest novel, which Freud described as the most magnificent novel ever written. Indeed, I read it twice and was very pleased with the translation skills of Ignat Avzy, who was clearly able to bring the text to life in a very direct and readable way. Although in the back of my mind I was on the lookout for any other of Dostoevsky's major works translated by Avzy, it was not until early 2018 that I had discovered that he had also translated The Idiot. And on learning this, I immediately ordered it. I had tried to read The Idiot several years earlier, but had given up. But now with Avzy's translation and perhaps my own readiness for the book, I was immediately hooked and could definitely relate to the quote from Virginia Woolf on the endorsements page. The novels of Dostoevsky are seething whirlpools, gyrating sandstorms, waterspouts, which hiss and boil and suck us in. They're composed purely and wholly of the stuff of the soul. Against our wills, we're drawn in, whirled around, blinded, suffocated, and at the same time filled with a giddy rapture. Is that possible? That's not only can I not read this, I have to turn around and it's blocked. The seething whirlpools start from the very first page, halfway through which Dostoevsky plants a powerful coincidence that has an enormous influence on the plot. The two main protagonists in the novel, Prince Mishkin and his nemesis Rogozhin, find themselves together in a third-class carriage of the train from Warsaw to St. Petersburg and strike up a conversation. The prince has come all the way from Switzerland, where he has been for 5 years to recuperate from a nervous ailment, while Rogozhin is on a considerably shorter journey, much nearer St. Petersburg. Concerning this encounter, Dostoevsky writes, had either of them, and this is on the first page of the book, and had either of them been aware of what it was that united them, they'd have wondered how it was that pure chance had brought them face to face in the third-class compartment of the Warsaw-St. Petersburg train. But not only are Mishkin and Rogozhin traveling in this particular third-class compartment, so too is another significant character in the novel, the sly toady Lebedev, a troublemaking busybody who knows far too much about Rogozhin's affairs, though they have never met. Thus, Dostoevsky provides the reader with a double coincidence in the first few pages and does not let up either with the coincidences or the sustained intensity as the story unfolds. And it was this particular coincidence that was for me the trigger to investigate coincidences in fiction and literature, and was very much a consequence of my unexpected meeting with Ignat Avzy all those years ago. This is the translator. This is Ignat Avzy in a later photo. When I started on this project, I thought about getting in touch with Avzy to thank him for our very brief interaction and for suggesting that I read his translation of the Karamazov Brothers. Also for his highly engaging translation of The Idiot, which I had only recently come across. Sadly, I discovered that he had died of cancer in 2013 at the age of 75. Just to get some idea of what Ignat Absa was like and why he might have marched off when I asked him if he was a translator, here is a sentence from his obituary in The Guardian. I first met Ignat in 1982 when offered as a publisher his first translation of Dostoevsky's black comic novel, The Village of Stepanchikovo, with his obsessions, limitless ambition, unpredictable mood swings, and unquenchable flow of language, which I learned to stem on occasion with a deft movement of the hand. He seemed to walk straight out of the novel. And this is why he just walked off from me, because he was a character of Dostoevsky who was translating Dostoevsky. I would think that an author is very fortunate indeed if their translator could have walked straight out of one of their novels. And Dostoevsky's unashamed use of coincidences ensures that characters of all manner of social and emotional disposition are thrust into one another's company at a fast pace, more often than not, resulting in outrageous scenes that literally have to be read to be believed possible. But how might we categorize the coincidental encounter on the train? In my book, The Many Faces of Coincidence, $20, I have suggested basic, that's a publishing price, I'm not getting anywhere there. In my book, I've suggested a basic fourfold categorization of coincidences of all types. These would range at one extreme from the stunning array of cosmic coincidences underpinning our universe and planet. As you know, we live in the Goldilocks zone, of the solar system. And without that, and so many Goldilocks factors, there wouldn't be life on Earth. So there are so many of what's called cosmic coincidences, which you can say is chance, or whatever you say, it still exists. From that at one end to the everyday coincidence in people's lives, which might be interpreted as occurring quite by chance or perhaps involving a rather more mysterious power, as that sentence from Dostoevsky implies. The four broad coincidence categories outlined in Many Faces are random chance, natural causality, supernatural causality, and synchronicity. I won't explain them now because it'll come on to them in a minute. These represent the four main ways in which coincidences are generally explained. The categories are by no means mutually exclusive, and there is room for considerable overlap. For instance, the coincidence described on the first page of The Idiot, where the two main protagonists meet in the same third-class compartment of the Warsaw-St. Petersburg train, could either be random chance or perhaps some other force, such as fate, destiny, or providence. If the latter is the case, and Dostoevsky seems to hint that it is, then we are looking at the coincidence category of supernatural causality. So if you say it was destiny that I met so-and-so, if it's total destiny that I met this person and then we got married, right? Maybe, logically that may be not valid, but actually people really do think like that. Including me. That's another, but not always, just sometimes. And that includes all ideas of fate, providence, or the apparent attraction of affinities. And anecdotes involving these kinds of interpretations are abundant in the many books in circulation about amazing coincidences. Natural causality, as a coincidence category, differs from supernatural causality in that it can be empirically verified. As when two or more people eat at the same restaurant on the same day and seemingly independently come down with food poisoning. Natural causal connections are similarly involved when two commuters from the same neighborhood come across one another going into work on the train. These are examples of common cause coincidences, as are the many simultaneous or near simultaneous discoveries and inventions in science. A famous historical example of this is the application for a patent for the telephone on the same day in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray, though they were not the only contenders. Common cause coincidences are to be distinguished not only from chance coincidences, but also from those that result from direct cause and effect, as when one person steals another's invention, which is what Gray accused Bell of doing, or when someone wins the lottery twice, not by chance, but because the outcome has been fixed. We can see something similar in the stuffing of ballot boxes in rigged elections. Okay, so natural causal explanations. Common cause, for example, parallel scientific inventions. These occur as a result of previous developments and discoveries. So the telephone is based on the telegraph, and then from the telephone we get radio, the TV, and the internet. So all these are based on previous discoveries. And direct cause and effect, stealing another's invention. Sometimes, however, it's not easy to distinguish between the two, these two, which can lead to court cases. A fairly recent accusation of invention theft concerns mobile phone technology, in this case a dispute between Apple and Samsung, with Samsung ordered by a California court in 2018 to pay more than $500 million for copying iPhone design patents. So it's obviously going on all the time. Returning to the coincidence in the third-class carriage and how it might be categorized, it clearly cannot be due to common cause factors, as with commuters traveling into town from the same suburb. For Prince Michigan has come all the way from Switzerland after an absence of 5 years. Similarly, their meeting would not come under the fourth category of synchronicity, the term coined by Carl Jung for a specific class of coincidences that are characterized by the numinosity and meaning they hold for the experiencer. Now, Jung said synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. So coincidences can happen, but only some of them are meaningful. Jung refers to an equivalence of meaning between an external circumstance and the psychic state of an individual that occurs during a synchronistic event, alongside a flash of immediate insight that he called absolute knowledge. Before I go to that, I'll give an example. A few years ago, I went to see a cousin, and I brought her a book called Gamma Healing, because she'd been through a divorce, sort of a new agey book of how to heal using this guy's ideas. And she'd been through a divorce and was kind of looking for a job. And when I arrived at her house, she was on the phone, and I was sort of hanging around. And then she came off her phone, and I said, "Here's your present." And it said Gamma Healing. And she said, "I can't believe it. I just got a job with a company called Gamma." And so she was like, that wasn't my coincidence, it was hers. And the two things happened. So, 3 key ingredients. So all these are present for her. An equivalence of meaning between an external event and deep psychological processes in the individual involved. So the Gamma was boom, from her psyche to the book. And the accompanying feeling of luminosity. Luminosity is a kind of feeling of awe, experienced as an emotional charge. And 3, a flash of total insight, or as Jung called it, absolute knowledge. So in that moment, this is before thinking about it, you just know that this is real. There may have been hints of some sort of affinity in their encounter, but for neither Prince Mishkin nor Rogojin did it involve a meaningful coincidence of the caliber outlined here. We are left therefore with supernatural causality, and very likely Dostoevsky himself, particularly given his strong religious beliefs, would have had no difficulty in agreeing with this assessment. Now, it might be thought that all forms that for all forms of fictional composition, from the Greek tragedies to South American magical realism, the author has a built-in bird's-eye view of the direction of the story, and therefore, like Dostoevsky, can come to a decision whether to include a sense of fate, destiny, or providence in the narrative. But that is definitely not the case. In Greek tragedies, for example, the author had to follow the mythical structure on which the story was based and not deviate from it. It would have been inconceivable in 5th century BC Greece for a tragedy not to have a predetermined and fatal outcome, the seeds of which are sown at the start of the story. The story of Oedipus or Electra, you can look at those and you'll see them. The tragedies were always the acting out of myths well known to the audience, who, by watching them dramatized, would presumably have a much greater cathartic experience than simply listening to a storyteller. The playwrights could make adjustments for dramatic effect, especially with dialogue, but they could not veer from the core elements of the myth. The same goes for fairy tales. As with myths, you have fate masquerading as chance. For example, let's take the beginning of the story of Briar Rose, which is more commonly known as Sleeping Beauty. In the Grimm brothers' version, a king and queen have longed for a child for many years, and when a beautiful daughter is born, there is great rejoicing. A celebratory feast is announced, and 12 wise women are invited, although there are 13 in the kingdom. Only 12 are invited because the king only has 12 golden plates. The feast is held, and afterwards each of the 12 bestows a blessing on the child. But just when the 11th has bestowed her gift, there is a disturbance at the door, and in comes the uninvited and furious 13th wise woman, who pronounces that in her 15th year, the princess will prick her finger on a spindle and fall down dead. Straight after that, she turns around and storms out. The 12th wise woman then steps forward and says she cannot negate the curse, but she can soften it, declaring that the princess will indeed prick her finger on the spindle, but will not die. Instead, she will sleep for 100 years. Already in this first part of the story, there are two important coincidences. Firstly, there are 13 wise women, but the king only has 12 golden plates. Clearly, he lacks imagination, because instead of finding a way around this discrepancy, he decides to leave out one of the wise women, an error of hospitality that he should surely have been aware of. But he seems not to have been the wisest of kings, and that you can see that in the rest of the story. The second coincidence is absolutely essential for the progression of the story, and it is that the entry of the 13th wise woman comes precisely after the 11th has given her blessing. This means that only the 12th is left to try to mitigate the curse. Had she arrived any earlier, the combined wishes of the remaining wise women would probably have been enough to outweigh the evil wish of their sister, and had she arrived any later, there could have been no softening of the curse, and the princess would have died. For in fairy tales, as in myths, when a prophecy is uttered, its outcome is certain, unless there is a sort of mitigation provided by another prophetic figure, like the 12th wise woman. As far as categorization is concerned, all the coincidences that occur in fairy stories can be really only understood as fate masquerading as chance coincidences. Expressions such as, "it so happened on that day," are common, and without such occurrences, the stories would not carry their magical charge. So when you say, "it so happened on that day," or "once upon a time," immediately there's a charge, and people listen, not only children. The stories would not carry the charge and would be lifeless. This suggests there is something about coincidences that goes right to the core of our existence. Now, why I'm interested in this area, because I do believe coincidences go to the core of our existence. They are much more frequent than what we what we give credit for. And the fact that we are alive at all is the most amazing coincidence, which we won't get into right now. Okay, now I'd like to move on to the idea of providence, which held sway in European fiction until the late 19th century. Providence essentially means a benevolent divine plan, a pre-Christian concept that was later adopted by Christian theologians, including the highly influential Saint Augustine. Augustine rejected the concepts of both chance and fate and held that, to quote, divine providence operates in all things, no matter how mundane and obscure. We can see how strong this notion was in Shakespeare. Hamlet, for example, shows a very firm conception of providence. Just before his death at the end of the play, when Hamlet is offered a way of avoiding what is to be a fatal duel. Okay, he's going to have a duel, and they don't know, but he could easily be killed in this duel. And so his number two man, Horatio, says, I can find a way to delay them so you can run off and not have a duel. But he refuses. And in his refusal, he includes the idea that providence is fixed and free will cannot fight against it, whatever various fortune-telling systems might say, be it the runes, astrology, or palm reading. Hence Hamlet's conviction that all that can really be achieved is readiness for what will come. Why is that?
Press on the cross there.
Is where?
Press on the cross. No, go back down to the black please. And on the, see the cross? Yeah. Click on that.
Wisdom. If your mind is like anything, means if you don't want to fight, obey it. I will forestall their repair hither. Repair means their arrival here, and say that you are not fit, you are not able to do it. Hamlet, not a whit, no way. We defy augury. Augury means all forms of fortune telling. There is a special providence in the fall of the sparrow. If it be now, it is not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. So everything is to be ready. Up until the late 19th century and the spread of ideas from Darwin's Origin of the Species, fiction was profoundly influenced by what has been called the providential tradition. And one of the most important elements of the providential tradition was the use of coincidences an integral element in the plot. The Victorian literary scholar Barbara Harvey puts it very simply. Coincidence is a symbol of providence. This is not so far removed from how fairy tales operate, and one only has to look at the coincidences that are an integral part of Charlotte Bronte's immensely popular Jane Eyre to see how fairy tale-like the book is. Have you read it? Or read it? Bronte's use of coincidences in Jane Eyre, in terms of categorization described earlier, is actually quite varied, and goes beyond the usual mythological method of fate or destiny masquerading as chance, or in this case, the guiding hand of providence. There are nevertheless a good number of these types of coincidences. For those unfamiliar with the story, at a crucial point in the book, Jane finds herself destitute and starving and wandering about the moors. She calls out to Providence for help. Shall I be outcast again this night, while the rain descends so? Must I lay my head on the cold, drenched ground? I fear I cannot do otherwise, for who will receive me? But it will be very dreadful with this feeling of hunger, faintness, chill, and this sense of desolation, this total prostration of hope. O Providence, sustain me a little longer, aid, direct me. Shortly after she utters her plea for help, Jane sees a light in the distance and feels drawn by it. It is a house, and through the front window she sees two graceful young women studying a German text. Jane is so taken with them that she forgets her predicament until they are about to leave the room. She gathers her courage and knocks at the door, but the housekeeper refuses to let Jane talk to her mistresses and shuts the door on her, causing Jane to collapse on the doorstep in even greater anguish. But just at that moment, the master of the house arrives back. He takes pity on her and invites her in. And lo and behold, she has turned up quite by accident at the house of her first cousins, though it takes quite a lot more of the story to find that out. From a providential perspective, it is undoubtedly right that Jane's prayer should be answered, and this coincidence can be readily placed within the coincidence category of supernatural causality. But this is only one possible categorization, always apart from pure chance, though that would not have been Bronte's intention. The other possible explanation is that it is a synchronistic event, for Jane, a meaningful coincidence of great significance. Certainly Jane herself would have seen this coincidence as a miraculous answer to her prayer. Interestingly, answered prayer is not something explored in great detail by Jung in his writings on synchronicity. However, he does say that synchronistic phenomena are involved. But even if we do categorize this as a synchronistic event, it is very much overshadowed by a literary device that was often used in plays and novels of the pre-modern era, and this is kinship recognition. Shakespeare, for example, uses this device in both Winter's Tale and Twelfth Night. According to Hilary Dannenberg, who has written an important book on the topic of coincidence in fiction, the kinship recognition scenario is so basic in human experience that, when activated in narrative fiction, it has the power to override the potentially reality-destroying signals of implausibility in the coincidence plot. So if you have a meeting of long-lost family members, any kind of coincidence that brings them to bear is far less powerful than the actual meeting. In other words, the outrageous coincidence of Jane Eyre ending up on the doorstep of her cousins is overridden by the power of kinship recognition as a literary technique to pull in the reader. Dannenberg also points out that Bronte veers away from a providential explanation for this coincidence. In an earlier chapter, Jane makes reference to hidden sympathies that could well be behind the occurrence of otherwise unlikely coincidences, including the coming together of estranged family members. Sympathies, I believe, so this is Jane, it's a monologue of Jane. Sympathies, I believe, exist, for instance, between far distant, long absent, wholly estranged relatives, asserting, notwithstanding their alienation, the unity of the source to which each traces its origin. Whose workings baffle mortal comprehension, and signs, for all ought to be known, may be sympathies of nature, maybe but the sympathies of nature with man. This is a pre-Christian view that was not entirely extinguished with the ascendancy of the church, and indeed ran parallel to it, especially in the thinking of the medieval alchemists and natural philosophers. Jung refers to it as a possible background explanation for synchronicity. Citing the following quote from Hippocrates, "There is one common flow, one common breathing, all things are in sympathy. The whole organism and each of its parts are working in conjunction for the same purpose." In Jung's opinion, this sort of thinking was very much alive in the Europe of the mid-20th century, so how much more so in Bronte's time? And despite the providential perspective so dominant before the ascendancy of secularism. But before leaving the 19th century, it is worth mentioning that when a particular author's name is entered into an internet search along with coincidence, the name that comes up with the most entries by far is that of, if you put coincidence, author coincidence, who will come up as number one? Charles Dickens. He's just packed full of them. Unfortunately, there is insufficient time to explore the many ways in which Dickens uses coincidence to augment his plots. The same applies for Thomas Hardy and George Eliot. So in the 19th century, these guys just went overboard with it. Moving into the 20th century, there is a little let-up in the use of coincidences by novelists. Despite the increasing secularization of society, a wonderfully blatant example is to be found in Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, which first came out in 1934. The murder of a particularly unpleasant American millionaire has been meticulously planned beforehand by 12 people who have all suffered profoundly because of a vicious murder he committed a few years earlier. They booked sleeping cabins on the Orient Express from Istanbul to Paris, alongside the millionaire, filling up all the first-class compartments, except for one, which fortuitously becomes occupied at the 11th hour by none other than the world-famous Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. So he gets the last compartment. According to one reviewer, the great Belgian detective's guesses are more than shrewd, they are positively miraculous. Although both the murder plot and the solution verge upon the impossible, Agatha Christie has contrived to make them appear quite convincing for the time being. And what more than that can a mystery addict desire? So the real skill here is that of Agatha Christie. She can use the most almost absurd plot, and yet people are like this. Perhaps the most famous novelist in the early part of the 20th century who makes good use of coincidences is Joseph Conrad. In his novel Chance, for example, the trigger for all later action is a chance coincidence of surnames, in this case Powell, between one of the main characters and the shipping official who, although they are unrelated, uses their coincidence of names to recommend his namesake for the position of second mate on a ship that is about to sail. So this one coincidence just directs all these other things in the story. And then there is Joseph Conrad's short story, The Secret Sheriff, which involves a doppelganger relationship, which means doppelganger means two people who are almost the same, and is almost pure coincidence from beginning to end. There is a Chinese saying, no coincidence, no story. And I've thought a lot about that. I even did an internet search to see if anyone thinks it is possible to write fiction without using coincidences. I used a number of different search criteria, but only came up with one direct question on the subject on a writer's forum. The question was this: is it possible to write a fiction without a coincidence? The person wrote a fiction, not just fiction. So the number of affirmative but unconvincing answers were given, with one claiming that the best detective stories do not need coincidences. Unfortunately, the responder failed to provide a concrete example of even one, which rather weakens his or her case. A firm proponent of this dictum, no coincidence, no story, is the English professor Walter R. MacDonald, author of the journal article, Coincidence in the Novel, a Necessary Technique. He writes, coincidence is the stuff fiction is made of. The necessary trick of the writer is to make the coincidence seem natural. MacDonald makes the observation that novels are by their very nature inundated with coincidences. It is the writer's skill, he argues, to piece various disparate occurrences together in such a way that their juxtaposition is accepted as natural by the reader. If we were to analyze this in terms of the categories mentioned earlier, all plotting using coincidences would come under the natural causality coincidence explanation. Indeed, all fictional coincidences would initially come under this category, and the branching out to the other categories would be part of what we might call a second level categorization, which which Jane Eyre, for example, is full of, including at the end of the book, where there is an instance of direct telepathy. For those of you who have read Jane Eyre may remember, she's about to marry her cousin, agree to marry her cousin St. John Rivers, and suddenly she gets this from what's his name, Rochester, who wants to become them back. And so she gets this strong telepathic message, and it makes her go back. But back to MacDonald's analysis. He writes that just because a situation in a novel may not look like a coincidence to the reader, it does not mean that it is not a coincidence. For instance, he states that having characters come together at just the right time is a major coincidence. And it is the writer's job to create all sorts of causal connections so that the characters appear to synchronize naturally. So a skillful writer uses coincidences to appear like causal connection, and the more skillful, the more convincing, according to MacDonald. If the writer consistently pulls off his trick, letting us believe that these events are growing out of a given story, then we read on, and the characters take on a life independent of their creator. In other words, the magic of literature has happened to us again. One of the examples MacDonald uses for the magic of literature is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And we can certainly say about Dostoevsky that he doesn't appear particularly concerned one way or the other by the presence of coincidences in his plotting. As with all great literature, it is the brilliance of the writing that counts and the effect it has on the reader. And this brings us to another Russian writer, one for whom coincidences were more than simply a necessary technique for plotting, but rather part of the fabric of life itself. This is Boris Pasternak, and he only wrote one novel, the magnificent Dr. Zhivago. And he wrote it under the most trying conditions in Stalin's Russia, when so many of his fellow writers had been executed or sent to the Gulag. Pasternak managed to get his manuscript out of the Soviet Union in 1957, and in 1958 he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he was subsequently forced by the communist authorities to refuse. But our focus here is on the coincidences to be found in Dr. Zhivago, which are not only prolific, but also a deliberate choice on the part of Pasternak. As the English poet and writer John Wayne observed, most novelists have been studious of probability. Pasternak goes out of his way to introduce walloping coincidences. Perhaps the description walloping coincidences is an understatement. The coincidences in the novel from its very outset and at several levels are unrelenting and far too profuse, even to enumerate. Some idea is provided in this character map of Dr. Zhivago, which I found on the Wikipedia site for the book. It's pretty complex, but it has all these links. So person A comes here, you don't know they're linked to someone over here. Even though it's extremely hard to read, you can get some sense by looking at the arrow, all the arrows, at how the characters are interconnected. The five main characters are in rectangular boxes. Up there is Viktor Ivlitovich Komarovsky. He's the main baddie. Then we have Yuri and Lara. If you've seen the film, those are the main characters. And then we have Yuri's wife, Tonya, and Lara's husband, Pasha. As those who have seen the film will know, the central feature is the love between Yuri and Lara, set amongst the tumultuous years of the Russian Revolution. The connection between Yuri and Lara starts early on, even before they're introduced to one another, and remains throughout their lives, though they are not really conscious of its depth until near the end of their days together. As a girl in Moscow, Lara is seduced by her mother's financial advisor and lover, the lawyer Komarovsky. And to take revenge a few years later, she decides to shoot him at a Christmas party to which Yuri has also been invited. Fortunately, she misses. Yuri witnesses that what happens but does not stay, and the incident is smoothed over by Komarovsky. We first meet Komarovsky in the opening chapter, where he is to blame for a once wealthy businessman leaping to his death from a train. The action takes place across the fields from where a 12-year-old Yuri happens to be staying with his maternal uncle. So Yuri is in some field and he sees a train and the train stops. He doesn't know there's any connection between him and the train. Also on that train is Misha Gordon, who was later to become a close friend of Yuri and on whom the suicide who jumps out of the train bestowed much affection before he jumped, affection that was clearly meant for his own son of the same age, whom he, Andres Chivago, had abandoned. So Chivago, father, jumped, and the son is watching the train. He doesn't know that his father has jumped. And he puts affection on the boy, Misha, because he didn't put it on his own son. A few years pass, and one day, while still schoolboys, Yuri and Misha accompany a doctor to a hotel where a woman has tried to poison herself. The situation is not dangerous. Before they leave, they observe a man emerge from behind the partition where the woman is recovering. On his way out, he gives a powerfully controlling glance of complicity to a girl sitting in the room. Though unaware of who she is, this is Yuri's first glance of Lara. She lives in the hotel room with her mother, who has already been jilted in favor of her daughter. Yuri has no idea who the man is, nor the significance in his own life. Here is a short extract as Yuri and Misha are leaving. Do you know who that man is, said Misha, when they came out onto the street. Yuri, busy with his thoughts, did not reply. He's the one who made your father drink and caused his death. The lawyer who was in the train with him. You remember, I told you. Yuri was thinking about the girl in the future, not about his father in the past. At first, he could not even understand what he was talking about. In any way, it was too cold to talk. Many years later, when they are living together in the Ural town of Uriatin, Yuri recounts these details to Lara. She remembers Yuri being there on that day, but had not realized Komarovsky had been the bane of his life as well as hers. Her immediate response is, "It isn't possible. How extraordinary. Can it really be true? So he was a tragic influence in your life too. It brings us even closer. It's as if it was all predestined." Predestined it all may have been, but the concept itself that everything is fixed and preordained is far too restrictive an explanation for the abundance of coincidences and significant interactions that take place in Dr. Zhivago. Perhaps a more satisfactory explanation is that mentioned earlier in connection with Jane Eyre, the idea of hidden sympathies and the coming together of affinities. Indeed, there are coincidences in the novel that only the reader is aware of, not the characters, that strongly suggest hidden sympathies. Now, this is really interesting. One of the most significant of these is the burning candle Yuri sees in a window as he and Tonya, his wife-to-be, are driven in a sleigh to the Christmas party at which Lara will attempt to shoot Komarovsky. Yuri has no way of knowing that an agitated and determined Lara is in the room with Pasha, a husband-to-be, and has asked him to turn off the electric lights so they can talk with just the candle glowing. In the text, the effect of the candle is described in this way. Its light seemed to fall on the street as deliberately as a glance, as if its flame were keeping watch on the passing of carriages and waiting for someone. So he sees a light in the window. He has no idea, and he's never even met him. Yuri is moved by the candlelight, and the stirrings of a poem arise within him. A candle burned on the table, a candle burned, he whispered to himself, the confused, formless beginning of a poem, which later is included at the end of the novel as one of Zhivago's poems. After the publication of Dr. Zhivago, in a letter he wrote in reply to an English school teacher, Pasternak provided the following insight into both his method and his understanding of reality. The objective world is my habitual natural grasp. In my habitual natural grasp is a vast, infinite inspiration that sketches, erases, chooses, compares and describes and composes itself. Living, moving reality in such a rendering must have a touch of spontaneous subjectivity, even arbitrariness, wavering, tarrying, doubting, joining and disjoining elements. Over and above the times, events, and persons, there is a nature, a very spirit of their succession. The frequent coincidences in the plot are, in this case, not the secret trick expedients of the novelist. They are traits that characterize the sometimes willful, free, fanciful flow of reality. That is a very rich conception of life. It is worth remembering that first and foremost, Pasternak was a poet and only came to the idea of writing a novel later in life. I read recently that a new translation is coming out soon in paperback, and when it does, I will get it, as it is a book that needs reading and reading. Actually, I've ordered it. Expensive, but I've ordered it. It's translated by his nephew. Up to now, we have been looking at what might be called pre-modern and modern forms of literature. Pre-modern forms of literature, which would include Jane Eyre, have strong elements of fate and destiny in them, and also a widespread acceptance of the idea of providence. What we can call modern or modernist form of literature came to the fore in the late 19th century with the rise of secularism. Dostoevsky is regarded as a very important precursor to modernism, and Joseph Conrad, a few decades later, was firmly in that camp, as was Boris Pasternak. However, in the 1960s, a new movement began to surface within literature, and this is postmodernism, which is characterized by the author's encouragement of the reader to make his or her own interpretations. The novels of Umberto Eco would certainly fall into this camp. Another good example is John Fowles, and those who have read it may remember that he gives the French lieutenant's woman a choice of endings. However, for this section, I'd like to look at Julian Barnes' Flaubert's Parrot, which came out in 1984. I have to thank Hilary Dannenberg for pointing out the significance in this novel in regard to coincidences and in her words. In many respects, Barnes' Flaubert's Parrot represents the zenith of the postmodernist coincidence plot, since it provides a complex and multifarious fabric of analogical coincidences with extensive meta-narrative comments on coincidences. We'll get on to what she means by analogical coincidences shortly. Meta-narrative here means observations in the main text, in this case about coincidences, in which the narrator becomes a thinly veiled vehicle for the author's own musings. The narrator in the novel is a retired doctor, Geoffrey Braithwaite, who is fascinated with the life and writings of Gustave Flaubert and has made a trip to Rouen, ostensibly to discover whether the stuffed parrot Flaubert wrote about still exists. But a deeper motive for his exploration, it gradually dawns on the reader, is Braithwaite's need to understand his wife's suicide. The major analogical coincidence in Flaubert's Parrot is that between Emma Bovary, the protagonist of Flaubert's most famous novel, Madame Bovary, and Braithwaite's wife, Ellen. They are both seriously unfaithful to their reliable husbands, and both commit suicide. Like Braithwaite, Emma's cheated husband, Charles, is a doctor. Dannenberg describes such coincidences as analogical, because they're not directly concerned with the plot of the story, but are rather, to quote, cognitively constructed through the perception of correspondences. In this case, the perception of correspondences is not only Braithwaite's, but also the reader's. Are the coincidences between the Bovarys and the Braithwaites genuinely meaningful? In other words, are they synchronistic? Or are they for Braithwaite ironic indications of a heavy-handed fate that he does not really believe in? Or is Braithwaite's obsession with Flaubert in fact triggered by these coincidences? In true postmodern style, it is up to the reader to come to his or her own conclusions, both about the correspondences themselves or about what they might mean to Braithwaite. An indication can be found in a chapter appropriately entitled Snap, in which Braithwaite addresses the question of coincidence. As for coincidences in books, there's something cheap and sentimental about the device. It can't help seeming aesthetically gimcrack. The troubadour who passes just in time to rescue the girl from a hedgerow scuffle, the sudden but convenient Dickensian benefactors, the neat shipwreck on the foreign shore which reunites siblings and mothers. So Braithwaite is questioning all these literary coincidences. But just to be clear on the connection between coincidence and irony, here's okay, so sort of a little further on, he brings in the notion that coincidence is irony. One way of legitimizing coincidences, of course, is to call them ironies. That's what smart people do. Irony is, after all, a drinking companion for resonance and wit. Who could be against it? And yet sometimes I wonder if the wittiest, most resident irony isn't just a well-brushed, well-educated coincidence. Just to be clear on the connection between coincidence and irony, here is a rather good example. Okay, there are two ironies here. Can you see the second one? At the back, our most valuable resort, 663 feet ahead. The driver, but he's done the crash. So that's ironic, because everyone will be looking at it, laughing, ha ha ha. Beyond the above reference to irony, there is no attempt by Braithwaite to explain coincidences, or even to dismiss them as mere chance, though that seems very much to be the attitude he would arrive at, if pushed. The beginning of the book starts with Braithwaite's search for Flaubert's stuffed parrot, and he finds that both the museums in Rouen dedicated to Flaubert have what they consider to be the actual parrot. If this is a coincidence, it could clearly be categorized as having a common cause, in addition to its being a witty and resident irony. Braithwaite later learns that Flaubert borrowed a stuffed parrot from the museum of Rouen and also returned it. At the end of the book, Braithwaite recounts a visit to the natural history section of the Museum of Rouen, where he finds 3 other parrots that could just as easily have been Flaubert's, not counting any that might be missing from the collection or had been thrown out over time because of deterioration. So they're left with a strong perception of the link between coincidence and irony. And if there is an antithesis to the numinous quality of a synchronistic event, this would pretty much be it. So in a powerful synchronicity like the one of my cousin getting the camera book, this is ha ha ha. That's kind of like at the antithesis. While a full-bore synchronous experience is accompanied by feelings of luminosity and illumination, with irony there is jaded humor, but little else. So that we don't leave out the present day, and I promise you this is the last example I will present, I would now like to jump ahead to the early 2010s and an adventurous and entertaining novel that deals directly with the subject of coincidences, John Ironmonger's The Coincidence of Authority. As you're no doubt aware, there's been a considerable amount written about coincidences in the last 20 or 30 years. very much in line with the public interest in spiritual matters. At the same time, a number of books have been released actively debunking such ideas of synchronicity and the attraction of affinities, by showing how even the most extraordinary coincidences can be explained mathematically. All this provides a great opportunity for Ironmonger to write about coincidences and their interpretation in a fictional scenario. One of the two main characters in the Coincidence Authority is Thomas Post, a lecturer in applied philosophy at London's University's Institute of Philosophy. He is known as the Coincidence Man because of his interest in coincidences and his zeal in being able to account for them mathematically. And the other is the highly coincidence-prone Azalea Lewis, also at London University, teaching English literature at Birkbeck College. They first encounter one another in a serious pile-up on an escalator on the London Underground, in which they are literally thrown together. Thomas breaks an arm and Azalea a rib. They are taken to one side by paramedics and find themselves, to quote, propped up on the cold stone floor, leaning against the wall. His broken arm was still draped around her shoulder as if they were a couple. In shock and pain, neither of them sought to move. But then they are driven to different hospital emergency units, so have no time for introductions. Notwithstanding his condition, Thomas becomes acutely aware of Azalea and thinks of her during the next few days, wondering how he might find her again. With his arm in a plaster cast, Thomas is soon back at work, and during a lecture he explains the famous birthday problem, which states that it is mathematically more than 50% likely in any group of 23 people for two of them to share a birthday. This is called the birthday problem. So if there are 23 people in the room, more than 50% chance that two will share a birthday. That is all statistical. There are 25 students in the class, which with Thomas makes 26, and not unexpectedly, two people do share a birthday, Thomas being one of them. What is more unexpected, however, is the student he shares his birthday with has the same surname, Post, and moreover, his arm is also in a plaster cast. Gasps of astonishment come from the class, but all this is grist for the mill for the Coincidence Man, as he tells his students to go away and work out the probabilities. Of course, sooner or later, he is sure to meet Azalea again. And when that happens, they inevitably fall in love, though their relationship is tested by their different perceptions of the nature of coincidences and the reasons for their occurrence. The intensity of Azalea's proneness to coincidences almost throws Thomas off his convictions and mathematical explanations. But not until the very end is the unexpected and very cleverly conceived resolution to Thomas's conundrum revealed. With its mind-boggling array of coincidences and its movements backwards and forwards in time as well as geographically, the Coincidence Authority is very much a postmodern novel, though it may well be knocking on the doors of an integrated conception, which we might call teal, beyond the characteristic irony and nihilism of postmodernism. Now, I believe one of the reasons why people are happy with the election result is because of the teal candidates, because they actually integrate left and right in a very amazing way, and the Greens. Different topic. And I must say, the ending took me quite by surprise. All right, now we're going to do a quick coincidence analysis. What would you say for this one? Okay, we've got 4 categories: chance, natural causality, supernatural causality, synchronicity. I would say chance. You could say some natural causality because everyone's in trucks, but Taylor Swift is very unlikely. All right, next one. I'd say natural causality. So what do you think happened here?
Maybe
Diabetes organization, so, there's an extra part of the poll, let's put that thing up. Now, I don't know if this is fixed. It could be direct, it could be fixed, but let's assume that it is an accident. But it's an irony, because everyone thinks the UN never does anything about world peace.
What's the third category?
Third category is supernatural causality. We're not going to get into the supernatural. And this is the weirdest one. I can't get this one. Now, who would have come first? You'd have to think the adult video came first, and then the church, well, I mean, that I don't know, but it could be anything. Anyway, it's a bit of fun. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions in the room or online? Let's find out who's okay. There's Deborah and Gil and Carl there.
You might want to see the chat so we can